Welcome to Globespan. I'm Paul Nehru, Tennessee of Guyana. Tonight we are discussing global poverty and inter-ethnic challenges. We have a very good group of guests who will engage in this discussion on this subject, but we will also focus quite a bit on Guyana and South Africa. Uh, with us today is my co-host, Floyd Haynes. He's a professor at UDC, businessman, and he has one foot in Guyana and one foot here in the US. He's currently there in Guyana. We also have Mr. Timothy Jonas, Senior Counsel, the chairman of a new United Guyana political party, which is in the opposition, a frequent guest on the program. And we have two new people who have never been before on Globespan. We have Professor Naresh Singh, Dr. Naresh Singh, who's the director of the Center for Complexity Economies, Applied Spirituality, and so forth. But basically, I know Naresh very well. Naresh has been a global expert on all this issue of poverty and development. He's worked in Canada with the Canadian Development Agency. He has worked at UNDP, and he's authored a book years ago where he outlined very clearly how we should deal with poverty. He calls it sustainable livelihoods. And I've always believed in it and always believed that you had to take a grassroots approach in dealing with poverty and not just focus on the macro. But he will tell you a bit about himself. He'll tell you about what he's doing now. And from what I heard last, he's on his way to India as soon as that problem with COVID is drastically reduced, of course, to take up a position as assistant dean and a full professorship in a university in India. And then we have with us my favorite guest, if the gentleman will not feel bad about that. And her name is Miss Shalane Baila. And she sent me a note to make sure that I pronounce her name correctly, Shalane Baila. Shalane used to be a student at the University of District of Columbia, and I got to know her very well, and she became the president of the Community College Student Government. She did an excellent job. She did a wonderful campaign to win. And she's an example how you could go beyond the ethnic, because she doesn't look Afro-American, with UDC is predominantly African, but she was able to carry a campaign and win the elections. I hope one day she does the same thing in South Africa. So Shalane has been working has evolved into a very important professional in South Africa, in Johannesburg. She does monitoring and evaluation. She's a specialist, but in global development. And she will tell us a bit more about herself, keep us updated. So in the old tradition of the lady before the gentleman, I will ask Shalane to give us a quick update about what's happening in South Africa now.
Thanks very much, Paul. So I'm happy using old traditions, but in my generation, we think about gender neutral more than anything. But just to give you a quick update on what's happening, things have drastically died down in South Africa. There is no longer any looting or burning in any of the areas. As commonly known, ex-President Jacob Zuma had not appeared in court and was sentenced to 15 months in prison for contempt of court. This happened on the 8th of July. And then on the 9th of July, there was looting, unrest, burning of shops in certain areas. This lasted about 9 days until the 17th of July. And various activities were aimed at what is now seen as economically destabilizing South Africa. The Office of the Presidency is calling this economic sabotage. So far to date, everything has died down. It's quiet in South Africa, and we're busy with recovery efforts at the moment.
Okay, I'm gonna just mention a few things. We want to tie the global poverty within ethnic challenges. What we find is that in many societies, when there is a crisis and there is deep poverty, it ends up in inter-ethnic confrontations. Now, I am very familiar with Johannesburg. I've been there and I'm familiar with the immigrant population there too. And I could recall a couple of years ago when South Africa went into a kind of a low growth and the economic situation was difficult, that Black immigrants from other parts of Africa, Nigeria and other parts of Africa that went to South Africa, became the victims of violence. In recent times, a lot of folks, like the people we know, Shalane from GOPIO, the Global Indian Organization, they have put out a lot of statements that in the conflict that recently occurred, that Indians particularly were selected to be attacked. So, but you could comment on these things and tell me what is your opinion of it. But I just want to touch on a few points. Is that by 2021, the ANC was not as popular as when it first got into power. As you are aware, in the local government elections, there were 4 metropolitan areas that they had lost the majority. Now, COVID definitely was a problem. In 2020, the economy contracted by 7%. Poverty increased by 2 million. There was a low growth rate in 1919 of 0.2%. By 2018, it was 0.8%. And there has been, many people have been saying there is a great urgency for structural changes that is undermining the growth in the country and escalating poverty. Now, the most important statistic I thought was that unemployment, according to the World Bank statistics, is 32.5%. But most interesting, that 65% are between the ages of 15 and 24, the youth. So, Shalane, tell us a bit about how you see poverty in South Africa and how you see it linked in whatever way to the recent conflicts we have had, and what's the way forward?
Thank you very much, Paul. So, I mean, when you think about what happened recently, there's a couple of factors that came into play. So, as you rightfully said, we do have high levels of unemployment and we do have high levels of inequity or inequality in the country. Your statistics are quite right that at least about 32% of the general population is poor, and youth make a higher percentage of that. So what happened has been pitched against the backdrop of high unemployment and high inequality. I mean, this has also been brought upon by a corrupt government under Jacob Zuma that has lasted at least about 9 years. So I have some figures that our Zondo Commission, which was the commission that was put together to basically investigate the charges of corruption that have been allegated against Zuma and his affiliates. And one of the statistics are that at least $3 billion have been linked to this corruption. I mean, that's about 0.7% of our national GDP. So the pro-Zuma instigators basically sparked a ticking time bomb that was around for quite a while. So with high unemployment, with low growth, with inequality, with the lack of jobs, it was only a matter of time that this action would actually happen, that people would get together. But I'd just like to mention a couple of things here. So when thinking about the groups that engaged in the looting and the burning of businesses and so on, we could think about these in 3 different groups. So the first would be your pro-Zuma supporters and possibly other instigators that instigated this unrest in the communities. So as mentioned, this was economic sabotage, where they targeted food systems through burning food depots and looting farms, as well as cutting off major highways that are key supply chains for goods, as well as also targeting oil refineries and manufacturing companies. So that's one group, that's the pro-Zuma supporters. The second group is the unemployed and the desperate. So this group saw this looting as a free-for-all and an opportunity to basically get food from stores, right? The third group, however, were just opportunists, I beg your pardon, not necessarily unemployed or desperate, but felt they needed a new TV, they needed an iPhone, they needed a PlayStation, and took whatever they wanted during all this chaos. So in essence, it's quite right to say that the looting has fallen against a backdrop of unemployment, inequality, and inequity, but also there's other factors such as corruption, a lack of ethics in our society, and not having the right structural economy to ensure that jobs are created through enterprises and so on.
Is it true that the Indians were targeted in Durban and other places, or what is your view? Well, there are different ethnic groups. There's the Zulus and there are others too. So how did that play out, the inter-ethnic thing in this time of crisis? And what is done right now to build the bridges? You sent me a lot of information of what's being done now to build the bridges.
Awesome. So in South Africa, a Black South African means that you are Indian, colored, or African Black South African. So that's how we view Black South Africans. So basically everyone that does not fall into the white group. Another factor that played a key role in this was irresponsible use of social media. So, often on Twitter, Facebook, whatever it is, someone sees one video of an old incident, not necessarily always in South Africa, not related to this looting, and they extrapolate from a sample of one that there is ethnic violence. My personal opinion is that Indians were not attacked. The latest estimates is 80% of businesses that were looted were Black African businesses. So in particular in South Africa, I don't really think this is ethnic clashes or related to different ethnic groups fighting against each other. The problem is poverty, inequity, unemployment, and a lack of jobs. Okay,
so gentlemen, we have read in the news about South Africa. Would you all like to comment about how you see it from a distance and what Shalane just shared with us? And we could always, share our opinions about other societies for that matter. We start with Naresh. Naresh?
Yeah. Yes, I'm happy to. Thanks, Shalane, for that nice and quick overview of what's going on. What I would like to contribute is a little bit of a history of the issue of poverty and inequality in South Africa. The first point is the one thing we need to bear in mind that South Africa now is perhaps almost the most unequal country in the world. The Gini coefficient, which we normally use to measure inequality, is I think of the order of 0.65 or 0.66 compared to, for example, Guyana, in which the Gini coefficient and inequality is about half of that, 0.34 or 0.35. So it's quite an important factor. But let me mention quickly, I worked in South Africa just when Mandela was about to take over the reins of government, just when he was released, 1994, 93 to 95 period. And what I observed were the following things. One of them was that it was pretty clear to us at that time. I was working for the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and we were investigating, it was just the early days of sustainable livelihoods work. And we were looking at what might be required for people who had been chased out of their ancestral homelands or their ancestral lands onto the so-called homelands. These were Black people who were driven off their land and had to be living on these areas which were not very productive. It was pretty clear, they survived largely off a subvention from government, what they called a pension, which was nearly 50 or more % of their household income. It was pretty clear to us that when the ANC will take power, that these people will become poorer. And that's one of the policy points I made in the transition period. I think it was a guy called Naidu who was a principal advisor to government at that time, that if you are not watchful, the poor blacks are going to become poorer under the ANC. Why? Because that pension will be removed, apartheid will be over, the pension which the white folks were sort of giving to black people to keep them quiet will be removed, and the blacks were so demoralized during the period of apartheid that they were not ready to take power. In fact, I wrote a book on empowerment years ago, and just around that time, and I realized that empowerment was a nonsense word. If, in this sense, that if empowerment means that somebody is about to give power to somebody else willingly, you know, somebody who has power giving power to those who do not have, does not happen normally. And people will have to take power. Now, to take power is not that easy. And in this sense, I mean taking control over your own life. Power in that sense. I'm not talking about political power now, or military coup, or that kind of thing. The demoralized black person, the very poor ones, were not going to be able to take power, and they would become poorer. And so the recommendation, which was adopted by the South African government, is that your social welfare ministry could not continue to function the way it did. It was tackling symptoms. It had now to tackle causes of poverty. And so, in fact, they changed the name at that time to the Social and Developmental Welfare Ministry, so that they would begin to engage in building the capacity of poor people to take power, to take control over their lives, and so on. The big problem was asset ownership. You see, income is only one aspect of poverty. If you don't look at the ownership of assets, you miss a very important factor, which we will talk about later on. And our field work in several countries across Africa, in fact, across the world, has demonstrated that. It's the basis of the sustainable livelihoods thinking. So what you find would happen, that we predicted then, was that the middle class and upper blacks in the country, access to education, business, and so on, will become better off, but there will be a fraction that will become poorer. And I think that's exactly what happened over time. And so we have this huge inequality. Now, how do we correct that? And Shalane probably has better answers than I do. But when I talk to you about, you know, the overall approach, the global approach to sustainable livelihoods, we can revisit that. Okay. But let me just leave it at that for now.
Thanks to both of you for giving us a context and a lead for a discussion. Floyd, what is your reaction to the views just expressed?
I agree with both the professor and Shalane. South Africa is not unlike most colonial countries, Guyana included. And that is, when we push for independence and we forced the British out, or in the case of South Africa, we push to end the apartheid system, which had to go. Anyway, it was a terribly bad system. But what happened is that I think in doing that, we took for granted the institutional arrangements and the development of the institutions and the individuals that were necessary to keep those systems going. We didn't realize what it took to keep them running and running successfully. And so what happened when the British left, or when South Africa transitioned the power and the ANC took over, they weren't prepared to take over those industries in totality. And what ended up happening, they mismanaged those industries, mismanaged the resources, and exacerbated an already bad situation. And I think you see that played out time and time again. Like I said, Guyana is a classic case. You can look at the bauxite industry or any of the other industries that when the British left, they sort of petered out over a period of time. And again, I believe we didn't have the institutional or the individual capacity to take over those things hook, line, and sinker.
Timothy, what's your views on this?
It's really difficult to improve on what I've just heard. I know very little about your beautiful country, South Africa, Ms. Baylor, so I'm not going to presume to comment on that at all. I was very interested, though, in your categorization of three groups of protesters. One that you identified as political, and I won't go there, as I said, don't know anything about that. The other two that you identified, the unemployed and desperate, you call them, and then the opportunists. I think that that is where the discussion needs to be, because for me, the middle class, people who incite their followers to violence and to looting, they don't go on the front line. The people who go on the front line are the poor and the desperate, the ones who have nothing to lose. They tend to be young, they tend to be single, they tend to have no jobs, no asset base, and nothing to lose. And I think that that's where we have to direct our attention if we are to avoid the kind of harm in the society that we see. I found it interesting that Naresh pointed out that we have to distinguish asset ownership from income. And again, really difficult to improve on that, because we see a group of individuals in the society who have a relatively large income. But in Guyana, we call them the richest poor people in the country because they misspend to such an extent, and their lifestyles are so ridiculously out of proportion to what it should be, that they never accumulate an asset base. I have a good friend who says they like the things that glitter. So they buy the things that glitter and that depreciate. Whereas someone with a much smaller income, but who has the education, the know-how, the understanding of how society works, will accumulate assets in a much more meaningful, much more intelligent way. And the end result is vastly different. So to me, it boils down to how we address poverty, recognizing, as the ancient Greeks recognized however long ago, that if you give a man an asset, if you give him a house, you give him a car, you give him the ability to sustain and protect his family in his house and his car. When the looting happens, he doesn't go out to loot, he stays home to protect his house and his family and his car. So we need to find a way to increase that middle class by giving them, empowering them, and educating them, not to misspend their income, but to be part of the constructive middle class. And that's where the conversation needs to be. And again, it's difficult to improve on what Floyd said, that this is a general and universal problem, where at the end of colonization, whether it was peaceful or by war, you had a group of people who did not have the skill set to run a country or to run a business, who pretended that they could take over from the experts, and we have seen it gradually run into the ground throughout the third world with a very few number of exceptions. And again, leading to increased poverty and erosion of the education system, which creates the vicious cycle. Poor education, less educated people, less competent people to grow up in the society and sustain the society, and you have a vicious cycle. So, Paul, it's hard to improve on what I've just heard. I think that we've identified where the problem is, and the larger conversation is the solution.
Yes. Before we go to discuss the more constructive thing of where we go forward and how we approach these problems, I just want to mention a few facts about Guyana. Guyana economy in 2020 grew by 43.5%. 1 year of oil, we have had already production of 74,300 barrels daily. We've had a lot of international investors coming into Guyana and investing. The economy is expected to grow by 26% in 2021. The government has disbursed about $10 billion to families and to children um, to deal with both the COVID situation and the increasingly the problem of the floods. But interesting enough, the remittances that Guyana and many countries like Guyana depend on, that is money that families abroad send to their families at home. In the case of Guyana, almost half the population is outside, majorly located in the United States and Canada, that 30% increase at the level of households in terms of remittances, which is 42% of the income of those households. Now, tourism had a big hit with COVID. By 80%, traveling contracted. And then in 2021, we had floods. Now, my question is, we've seen what happened with South Africa, where it exploded because of the factors that were mentioned. Do these factors that I've just mentioned about Guyana, in a country that is ethnically polarized, can we foresee that they can be a similar situation, and what can be done perhaps as we are looking at both South Africa and Guyana to avoid such a situation? Shalene, even though you're from South Africa, what do you think?
I mean, it's a bit hard for me to comment on Guyana because it's not a country I am aware of. But I do still think ethnic tensions can play up. Speaking from a perspective of being a millennial and the Generation Z, in South Africa, the ethnic tension is not such a big issue. I mean, I grew up when apartheid ended, I must have been about 8 years old. So everyone I went to school with, we mixed in different race groups. At university, we did the same. So it's a different dynamic. However, looking at Africa and the other countries that I do know, the ethnic clashes do play a role. I also believe that ethnic clashes are used as a tool by instigators and so on to actually gather people to rise up against the government or whatever the case may be. And this is more likely in situations of poverty. So, I mean, I'm glad to hear that Guyana is growing at such a good rate and so on. But I think in our situation, it's much more used as a tool to create tension.
Naresh?
I would have loved to hear Timothy first on that one, and then.
Okay. Timothy, you've just been appointed the next speaker.
Irish put me on the spot, but I don't mind. It's a subject that I think about a lot because it bothers me so much. You see, you used an example, the Because We Care program, the recent program we saw where money was handed out to parents, ostensibly for their children to go to school. So it was a possibly one-off, but certainly shooting from the hip policy rather than a systemic one, where the government decided to appoint a sum of money and allocate it to handouts. Now that is very similar in my mind to what Naresh was speaking about, which was, I'm sorry, it might have been you speaking about it, Paul, forgive me, which was the handouts that were called a pension that were given to the poor in communities in South Africa. Here's the thing, where race, ethnicity, and dependency are dangerous in Guyana. Because the population is so evenly balanced, the two ethnic groups, both feel threatened by the other. The razor edge is so thin in any poll, in any voting, in any election, that the threat is real. You see, if you only got 10% or 15% or 20%, as in Jamaica or as in the States, of a minority, that minority is not a threat. In fact, that minority becomes seen as a voting bloc, so that you subscribe to finding ways to please that minority so that that voting bloc becomes part of your support. But as soon as you have a situation where you don't have a minority anymore, you got 50-50, then you have a threat and you have a real problem. And that's where we are in Guyana. So how do we get past that? What I found is that the independent thinking voters in Guyana, and it's a very small, tiny minority, because 95% will vote along ethnic lines because of that perceived threat. They tend to be more educated. They tend to have a dollar in their pocket. They tend to live in urban areas where they rub shoulders with people that don't look like them. They tend to play sports where they go on a sports field with people that don't look like them, and therefore they judge a man or a woman's character by their heart, not by how they look. So we're not speaking in absolutes, because you have very poor folk who play sport and rise above the instinctive ethnic loyalties. And you have people who are not educated, who will be in a workplace with people that don't look like them and judge a man by a method other than his skin color. Well and good. But in terms of generalities, that's what I found. And the problem with that is that it is not in the interest of an ethnic-based political party, a party that derives its power from that ethnic loyalty, to encourage a middle class to grow, because that middle class is the one that asks questions, that begins to challenge, and that moves away from the blind ethnic loyalty. So we have a problem, because our government would much prefer to show pictures of ministers going to hand out cash to some poor, almost destitute parent whose tears rolling out of their eyes, collecting this money and saying thank you very much to the minister who's almost made a deity. Because that dependency creates gratitude, but doesn't elevate the recipient from the position that they are in. It doesn't elevate them from poverty. It doesn't allow them to be empowered and to rise above so that they can start asking real questions in a meaningful way. And that's what we see. We have seen in Guyana that both sides derive their power from the blind ethnic loyalty that they get in the villages, where the people don't rub shoulders with people who don't look like them. And our solution, therefore, has got to be a more integral system of education, better access to education, not by some cash handout, but systemically, that through NIS, through school feeding programs where you can get meals in school, extracurricular activities in school, where the children are encouraged to spend more time in school and the parents are encouraged to let their children spend more time in school. Because the child will be fed, the child will learn a musical instrument, the child will play a sport. If that can be done, that child will develop better and that child will have an opportunity for upward mobility. The parent won't have the financial burden that it can be taken off by the state, but the parent will be able to retain the dignity that the system, the welfare system that we need to help our poor, is going directly in a systemic way to the child for the benefit of the child, and not in a way that demeans and takes away the dignity of the parent who is standing up with a photograph opportunity for the minister, collecting a check and saying thank you. So we need to understand how to help our poor in a way that is systemic, that is dignified, that recognizes the need and where it is, and that does not trample on the dignity of that same poor. But recognizing the two big parties can't do it, won't do it, because they derive their automatic loyalty from the same poor. And that's our catch-22.
Yeah.
So to resolve that, Paul, catch-22s are always difficult to resolve. But let me make one or two suggestions, building on what Timothy has said. It's always interesting to hear this perspective from somebody closer, because I have experienced ethnic strife in Guyana personally, I was born there and I grew up in Guyana, and witnessed and experienced this problem from. I was a young boy then, but nevertheless, it made a really strong impact on me. And I had friends, like so many other Guyanese, from both major ethnic groups, close friends. And one wonders, into the history of this thing. So I wouldn't bother to go into the history of the ethnic strife and the way politicians manipulated people, and the reason that these major political parties will not be credible in trying to fight poverty. That, like Timothy was saying, I can't improve on that aspect of his analysis. But coming back to the solutions and how do we deal with this issue, a few points. One, on the growth. The growth in Guyana is a single sector factor driving growth. And by definition, it is brittle. It is going to be subject to oil prices around the world. Now, I hear of all kinds of wonderful plans and transparency management and so on. And if all of that stuff is in there, and we have a great sovereign fund that could cushion oil price shocks and all, I hear really great governance and all political leaders are on board and so on. And if all of that is true, maybe we will be able to cushion shocks. Having said that, the remittances, that has been a major sort of, if you like, a cushion to poor people in Guyana, but it's also been having a negative impact. I gave a talk in New York when I was launching my book on sustainable livelihoods. And, I really got people riled up when I talked about the barrel economy and the potential harm that the barrel economy was doing to Guyana, especially when barrels were being sent to able-bodied young people. Now, if we are helping old parents or, the handicapped and people who can't help themselves, I have no problem with that. That's a good thing. That's charity. But development and charity are different things. And fighting poverty in a developmental way is different from providing charity. And having a young person in Guyana receive a barrel for $100 every month, which makes him or her not wanting to get educated, go to school, invest in some business, begin to own some asset, is about the worst possible thing that you can do to a young person, in my view. Having expressed that view, you can imagine that a lot of people were not comfortable with me saying that. I still hold that view. But the other point on remittances is that remittances is not development money. Like I said, it's largely private flows going to individuals largely for consumption, because it's delivered in relatively small amounts. Now we can convert that into an investment because there are financial instruments in which you can get a loan, based on income that will come from remittances or any other. And we can make it into an investment fund and begin to make that a development process at individual levels. Well, we can discuss that another time. The big point, though, about the ethnicity, and I like how Timothy linked the ethnic challenges with poverty, but left us with a catch-22. So the resolution, I think, is within the major ethnic groups themselves. I think we will have to have leadership within these groups to help those poor people within the major ethnic groups get out of poverty. Now, if you do a quick analysis of the nature of poverty in the Afro-Guyanese group and the Indo-Guyanese group, the nature of poverty is pretty different. The Indo-Guyanese group, the most recent paper I've read put out by a person from Cambridge who did an analysis, a sort of ethnic poverty analysis, which is one of the few of these kinds of analyses I've seen in the literature. And we know from, having been born there, and I come back to Guyana like every 2 years or so, or every year, the nature of poverty among Afro-Guyanese is an income issue. They seem to be out of poverty when income improves. But that, as we have discussed already, is not going to resolve real poverty. The ownership of assets among Afro-Guyanese has to change. Their rate of investment into small, medium, and micro businesses has to change. And so we have to have a strategy for addressing poverty within for our Afro brothers and sisters in a way that addresses the nature of poverty within that group. Within the Indo-Guyanese group, the nature of poverty is a combination of income poverty and asset poverty and structural nature. And here we have a different approach to solving that. And again, the leadership will have to come from within that community. Now the now the political leaders are typically problematic. So perhaps the minimum they can do is stay out of the way and put in place development enhancing policies. Somebody once said that development was what happens when government steps out of the way. In the case of Guyana, I'm hoping that the Guyanese government, and I have no doubt to believe otherwise, will put in place environment and poverty reduction friendly policies at minimum. And then leaders from civil society within these groups, will be able to take over and lead the way out. That would be my guess from a distance. And I'll be delighted to hear reactions to that as well.
Floyd, what is your take on this before we go on a break?
Okay, so I'm sort of going to be like that cheese in the nursery rhyme and perhaps stand alone in this, but I not particularly believe that government is the solution to most problems. Government can create the enabling environment, and the government can develop the institutions and the individual capacity, but it has to be a market-driven solution. And as Dr. Naresh says, government can create the enabling environment and then get out of the way. History has shown time and time again, education is one of the quickest way to get out of poverty. If you have a college degree, you're less likely to languish in poverty than someone without a college degree. The free market capitalist system, with all its fault, has lifted more people out of poverty. And so we need to unleash the power of the free market. We need to make sure that the playing field is level, right? A big part of the challenge in Ghana is that the playing field isn't level. But Dr. Naresh zeroed in on something that I've been talking about for quite some time, and he put it so eloquently. The leaders of each of these communities have to take on that responsibility of going and provide leadership, not just lead. They have to provide leadership. And what that means, you have to go to your community. You have to assess and analyze the problems and then give the people the problem to solve it along with the tools. You see, the people have to solve their problems. Nobody can solve it for you. But it requires the right kind of leadership operating in an enabling environment that the government provides. What is likely to happen in Guyana is not so much ethnic, or I prefer racial to ethnic, but be that as it may, what is likely to happen in Guyana is what has happened in most places with an abundance of resource, and that is a small few group of people will get enormously wealthy, and the vast majority of people will languish in poverty. And it is up to the people to ensure that that does not happen. And to be able to do that, you have to hold the government and the leadership accountable. They're not going to solve the problem, but they must make sure that the playing field is level. They must build the institutional and the individual capacity, and then the people can be able to solve their problems.
Well, I studied, among other histories, Japanese history, and it is true in the history of Japanese development that the government assisted to develop a private sector. But when it reached a point where this private sector was significantly developed, the government withdrew.
Yep.
I always like the German model. It's a Christian democratic model called, social market economy, where the Germans, the Christian Democrats of Germany believe for many years that the state should be like umpire. Look at private sector, look at labor and so forth, and make sure nobody is going off balance. They're facilitating. It's a very interesting concept. And when we come back, we will look a bit more about this because I mentioned these statistics not because I believe in them. I believe you could have 100% growth rate and people could remain poor. Growth without development, growth without jobs. We in the labor movement call it jobless growth and so forth. And then I have a comment by somebody who sent me a text that said our political leader here, Timothy, is downplaying the cash grant. So that's a political situation. So when I come back, we'll hear what Timothy has to say about that. Because that has been in the media, who's playing down the cash grant and so forth. So we'll go now on a break and we'll come back and we'll also have a quick overview of what's happening globally. Can we really resolve poverty only at the local level, national level, or it has to be a dance between the global and the national?
AllFromOneSupplier.com has launched preset value boxes. You can now save money when you order these preset boxes, which includes fish, meats, and pastries. Plus also cooked food like curry duck curry, curry goat curry, curry chicken curry, with galpuri or bus-up-shut of your choice. Plus, if you're too busy to cook, All From One Supplier will ship your meals directly to your home. Now you can order all your West Indian groceries with your curry powder, pepper sauce, or your preset value boxes with all types of fish, duck or goat, and your pre-cooked meals like curry duck curry, goat, or bus-up-shut and galpuri. We offer free shipping to all U.S. states and free delivery. So call us today at 718-551-3292 or visit us online at allfromonesupplier.com. Travelspan is pleased to announce Curry Duck Curry Punta Cana 2021. Yep, it's Travelspan Curry Duck Curry with an inclusive vacation 2-in-1 on August 12th to August 16th. Special performances by Terry Godraj, Sexy Marissa, the Tassamen, and the DJs are all going to Punta Cana on August 12th to August 16th. It's fun, games, party, and curry duck curry at VIK All-Inclusive Resort. All you can eat and all you can drink. Travelspan has flights from JFK, Newark, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Orlando, and Houston directly to Punta Cana. It's Travelspan Curry Duck Curry and an all-inclusive vacation. It's 2-in-1 on August 12th to August 16th in Punta Cana, Dominican Republic. All-inclusive packages include air, hotel, transfers, all meals and drinks from $9.99 persons. Travelspan Curry Duck Curry is sponsored by AllFromOneSupplier.com. Dave West Indian. Call Travelspan at 212-243-0865. That's Travelspan at 212-243-0865 or book on Travelspan.com. Globespan 24x7 continues.
Globespan. Before we left the conversation, there were quite a few items that were hanging. But before we get into those items, I just want to make a few comments that in 2005, a global call for action against poverty was taken by over 11,000 networks of civil society organizations in 58 national coalitions. And the dream and aspiration is that by 2030, we might have an agenda for sustainable development that we promoted in order to deal with poverty. At the sixth ministerial meeting of the World Trade Organization in Hong Kong, which I attended as part of a labor delegation, we had retaken this whole call for action against poverty to put it on the agenda. People dream of poverty becoming history. I always find it a bit ironic. I say ironic because I am fundamentally always had a foot in civil society. That when I enter the World Bank building, there is a big sign above, our dream is a world without poverty. Of course, during structural adjustment, people thought the World Bank was deepening poverty and the many demonstrations we have had. So in the United Nations, and I had the privilege of meeting both Camdesus, the head of the IMF, regularly, and also Wolfenson, the head of the World Bank, and the opportunity to meet Kofi Annan in the UN. Kofi Annan did a lot of work, and one of the items at the global level that has known by many people and is still on the agenda is the Millennial Development Goals. Eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, achieve universal primary education, promote gender equality and empowerment of women, reduce child mortality, improve mental health, combat HIV, AIDS and malaria, ensure environmental sustainability and global partnership for development. I just wanted to highlight some of those points because I think at the global level, there have been a concern, and I personally believe that this is a local global, a local issue. And at the University of District of Columbia, I'm very famous for organizing over 70 local forums because I always think what is local is global and what is global is local. At the UN once, on behalf of Labour, I made a speech, and I said that we have to have a Y2K approach to poverty eradication. And what did I mean by that? In the year 2000, we had a big problem, a technological problem where they said the world would stop with the computers because of zero. But private sector, civil society, governments, everybody came together and we were able to avoid that calamity that might have happened. And I use that as a way of saying to the leadership of the UN that we lack political will, we lack cooperation, we lack coordination, and we lack coherence at all levels in tables of governance, whether it's local, national, sub-regional, hemispherical, or global. So I just wanted to touch on these 2 points and say a word that many of our listeners who are out there, that they should try and get connected with folks that are really seriously working on the issue of elimination and eradication of poverty. I was a bit worried one point, and I had a discussion with the president of the World Bank on this when the UN said they're going to halve poverty. So I asked Wolfenson once, I said, listen, what are you going to do? Go into Calcutta and draw a line? This half is out of poverty and this other half is in? He told me that's not his thing, it's the UN thing. Anyhow, there's a big debate on this issue there. It's multidimensional. There are a lot of facets, but I encourage people to get involved. Now, I'm going to start with Timothy, then I'll, Dr. Narayan would like to speak a bit about education and pick up some of the points that were made. Timothy, somebody sent a note saying that you're trying to minimize the cash grants. What's your reaction to that? Is that currently, from what I've been reading in newspaper, there's to and fro about the cash grants. We saw your point. You made very good points and excellent points. But what do you think?
I'm going to be blunt.
To that viewer.
My reaction to that viewer is that he wasn't listening.
Okay.
Here's the thing, Paul.
Yeah.
We have a serious problem with poverty, and we need a plan to be urgently implemented. And the plan needs to be directed, as I said, at encouraging education and encouraging parents in sending their children to school. Now, the immediate and short-term decision to put cash in the hands of parents, especially given that we are now benefiting from economic growth and therefore have cash to give, is a good decision. It encourages the parents to have their children go to school. It enables them to keep the children in school, to buy uniforms, to deal with transportation issues, to pay for meals and all of that. It is a good short-term decision. There is no doubt about that, no gainsaying it. And I would ask your follower, your watcher, to show where I've said anything different. But the point I'm making is this, and I think it's a point that needs to be made, because people, in their blind support of their party, lose their objectivity and lose sight of the dignity that must be afforded to the citizens of Guyana. Henry Ford invented the assembly system, and he was a multi-millionaire. So he started and sat at his desk as a manager, as an executive, and he conceived and he conceptualized. And he designed the assembly system and rolled out the Model T Ford, and he made tons of money. And sitting at his desk, he dealt with finances, borrowing, sourcing from suppliers, organizing his labor. He did all of that at his desk, and he earned his millions. One of his workers who sat on the assembly line tightening the wheel on the Model T Ford might have earned $10 a week. He is one of the people in this structure that Henry Ford conceptually made. The only point I'm making is if the minister is going to pretend that he or she is earning the big dollars as a minister, as an executive, as a manager, then sit at the desk and conceptualize and come up with a system, a plan that allows the poor to understand that this is an entitlement as part of a structured welfare arrangement, that they go to NIS or they go to the post office and they get their money. But if the minister wants to pretend that he or she should go down on the assembly line to tighten the wheels by going up some creek or in some backdam to hand out checks and to take a picture with a poor person who has been demeaned by being published for all of us to see collecting this free money, that is politics, and that is ugly, and that is undesirable. And the minister who does that should be earning the $10 a week, because that's really what they're doing, wasting time, spending a day that they should be doing real work. They're doing it for political points, cheap political points, and they're doing it at the expense of the dignity of their followers. That has nothing to do with the fact that it is important for us to create a structure that is objective and fair and encourages children into school and puts money where it follows that policy of getting the children into school. They are two separate conversations. And that's what I would say to your reader.
You've made your point, attorney at law. You've made your point very well. We are aware that in Mexico and under Lula in Brazil, there was a program that was excellent. And the program was to provide a certain amount of money to families to ensure that the children go to school. And it was very successful. It was a good program, and but it was institutionalized. And
I think that Joe Biden has a program like that going on right now, Paul. Yeah. But you don't see Lula or Joe Biden shaking any poor person's hand in some trailer and handing out envelopes. And if you did, they will be lambasted on the media. But we are so accustomed to our oppression that we let it go.
Your point is taken. Now, Naresh, you wanted to say something about education.
Yes. Let me take as point of departure the point that Timothy was just discussing, and you as well. And you're quite right, Paul, that the conditional cash grants and conditional cash transfers, as the program is called, worked quite well in both Mexico and Brazil and elsewhere in Southeast Asia as well. And then the people raised the question as to whether it had to be conditional. You know, the conditional grant was that you will get this amount of money if the kids go to school. And then they tried unconditional cash grants, and that worked just as well in many places, where people living in poverty would use the money, but constructively in many cases, not all, some of them were consumption driven. But it has to be part of a system, part of an institutional arrangement, and not like we are hearing people showing up to give out money and to take photographs. That is not the way to do it. But I wanted to come back to the question of of education in Guyana. And I watch this thing and I hear this as well. And my way out of poverty, well, I should tell you that I did not know I was poor until I became a professional. When I studied poverty and read Amartya Sen and all these guys and became a director and I was the UN's principal advisor on poverty and sustainable livelihoods for several years. That's when I found out I was poor. But let me just say that in Guyana, I watched my friends who were not educated, who didn't go far at school, make much more money than I did.
That is true.
Now,
barefoot and driving a big truck and making money.
Now, the other point, the other observation is what's happening to our educated people. It has to be a two-way street, right? So the educated people have to contribute to the growth of the country and its development. So the labor market grows, the labor market becomes more sophisticated and can absorb people at different levels of education. If, however, 50% of our tertiary educated people coming out of UG are migrating, then is education a way out of poverty of Guyana?
No.
So now education, of course, we can't be critical of education because you get into trouble. I can't say education is like motherhood or apple pie. I'd probably have to say black pudding or something. But whatever we love so much, education is important. But here is the point. I agree that education is critically important, but is our style of education where we train our young people to expect a job in the economy the way they should be educated? Or should they be educated to understand that they need to create a job in the economy?
Wonderful. In the 80s, I have that documented. I advocated that we shouldn't be searching for jobs, but to create jobs. And we need to reorient the educational system. I worked out what you do with the 5 years at UG. In the third, fourth, or fifth year, you get a project, even supported by an international aid agency, that when you graduate, you get your degree and you get the check, and you go out in the world and try to create a job.
When you graduate, you get the Paul, let me make a point. That's why I said earlier, when I used education as a way out of poverty, I also mentioned development of institutions, right? So it's not just going out and getting an education. If you have developed institutions and working institutions, then it would create opportunities for people with education. It's sort of several things at one. And I also agree with Timothy. And by the way, cash transfers, good as they may be, don't lift people out of poverty. Let's be real. It's a very good thing, and we should do it, and it helps a lot of people. But we're talking about lifting people out of poverty. That is an entirely different task. And merely cash transferred is necessary, but not sufficient. There are other things that have to go in with that. And that's the only point I would make.
I agree. And what basically is coming together in this discussion is that we have to rethink how we approach poverty, and we have to do it in the context of the particular society and the differences in the society too. Dr. Narayan made a reference to the reality of Afro-Guyanese.
Yes, a different Dr. Narayan. I'm Naresh.
Sorry. Sorry about that, bro.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Singh, Dr. Singh made that point. It's very important. I believe strongly, though, that like all of you, you have not said different, that people who are in a state of hunger, we have to give them food. They have to get food. We have to give them immediately assistance. I believe in that. It broke my heart very often when I go through Adelphi in Kanji and other parts. I see little children eating rice, and I could observe that they had no yellow on it. There was no dal. They were eating bare rice. If I had the resources, I would have gone there and buy, every home, give them a bag of yellow peas, split peas.
Paul, may I make a point here? Let me make a point. we're sort of blurring the line between whether or not we have a responsibility towards our brothers or fellow comrades in arms and what is required to alleviate poverty. Those are very, listen, nobody will argue that we have a social responsibility towards our fellow man. And this is why you have charities and the Gates Foundation and all these types of things, right? But that's a very different thing than alleviating poverty within a society and globally. And oh, by the way, the poverty level globally has been on the decline. It's going to be a little under 1 billion. No number is acceptable. Let me put that out there. Let's start calling me.
I agree.
None of it is acceptable, but it's trending in the right direction. But what I'm saying is that what is required to alleviate poverty, whatever that means, and even that has its problem, alleviate poverty, it's very, very different than things that we think are necessary so that the average person can have a decent life or decent living. Those are very different types of things.
If I might, Paul, just to follow up quickly on that, is that okay?
Yes.
No. Yeah, the program is your program, guys. That's
yes.
Why you're
I
here.
just want to, but I want to make sure that I'm not too disorderly either.
No, it's okay.
So here is the thing. I think Floyd has just made a very important point. There is a big difference between developmental work, which is required for poverty eradication, and humanitarian relief,
yes,
which is charity.
I concur.
So that and the approaches taken are very different.
Two different approaches.
Yeah, right. And you know, they both important because when somebody is starving, they need to be fed, and we have that moral responsibility. But developmental work is quite different. Yeah. Let me share, just because I promised to do this, the approach that we had developed called the Sustainable Livelihoods Approach for poverty eradication globally. And we developed this in the early 90s, and it's been used in several countries around the world. And it has a few nuances. Here, briefly, is how it works. When we work with poor people in this approach, we don't start with what they need. We start with what they have. So it's called an assets approach.
I read that.
And what you do is you map the assets. Now, what are these assets? Poor people don't typically have much financial assets, but they have human assets, human capital. Then we have social capital, all their networks and so on. We have natural capital, you know, access, if they don't own it, access to land, access to water for irrigation. So we look at that aspect as well. And then you look at produced capital, which is physical and economic. And you take all five and you look at that capital or asset base. That is why I made the point earlier to distinguish between income and asset. And starting with that asset approach provides a very different approach. In fact, it sets the stage for self-empowerment to happen. You see, when people go in and say to poor people, you do not have, I have, I will give to you. That's like the cash grant. Yeah. You are setting up a cycle of dependency.
Absolutely.
The only way to break that is to start with what people have. They recognize this is their problem. Yes, they can't solve it on their own. They need help from the outside. But let's start by recognizing their energy, the little that they have, and build on it. So step one, assets. Step two, what is their vision of a better life? Not my vision or yours,
exactly,
but their vision. So that's step two. And they articulate it beautifully. I mean, I have done this in about 50 countries around the world in different contexts. So they articulate their vision, and they even put in indicators. You know, a group of women in Egypt with whom I was working, they said, I asked them, how would you know when you have a more sustainable livelihood? They say when the kids can go to school until they're 18 years old instead of having to leave at 14. Or when my house has a concrete roof instead of a thatched roof. And so they go on to give you indicators.
Exactly.
Then the next step is equally important. The third one is, what can you do on your own to get where your vision is? And only then, what do you need from outsiders? The need is still there, I don't doubt it, but you see the approach is quite different. And the need that the outsiders need to satisfy, sometimes it's not just money, it might be technology, It might be investment, yes, money, but it could be policy change or governance shifts. So then, if you are an NGO, you have a challenge. If you are a multilateral institution like the UN, for whom I was working, we have policy dialogues with government, and then you can make a change. But that's the approach we took. That is what is called the Sustainable Livelihoods approach. And I still advise the UN in many very difficult situations, like in conflict countries, Iraq, Yemen, Syria. Where is the poverty going to be? You know, we moved from the MDGs, which you referred to, the Millennium Development Goals, to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, from 2015 to be achieved in 2030.
Yeah.
And things were working out quite well. But while we were reducing poverty quite nicely, we had quite a significant reversal due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So about 100 million people compared to 2019 are now back in poverty.
Yeah.
And that, of course, needs to be taken into account as well. Yeah. And I would argue that this approach that I'm describing, the Sustainable Livelihoods approach, will, you know, like the name suggests, get people out of poverty, but help them to stay out of poverty.
Yeah.
If you reduce poverty and people get just above the poverty line, then any shock, political, economic, social shock to the system drives them back into poverty.
Yes.
Like the pandemic has done.
Yes.
And we need to bear that in mind.
Yeah,
so you wanted me to mention this book. I think the book that I might mention is the one that I did in 2014.
Tell us the name and
the first book is the one called Sustainable Livelihoods, Building on the Wealth of the Poor, which created a big confusion in the UN. When I said building on the wealth of the poor, they said, what nonsense is this?
The poor is not wealthy.
Poor people don't have wealth. It was deliberately chosen because we wanted to work with assets. Yeah. That one was published by Sumerian and should be available on Amazon.
Okay.
But the other one, which is called Legal Rights of the Poor, that one I did in 2014, and I know it is for $3.99 or something like that on Amazon, Kindle version. Legal Rights of the Poor.
People could put your name in Amazon and they'll get it. But
absolutely.
I want to make a point here. The point you are raising about assets is very important. Hernando Soto, who introduced the concept of informal economy from Peru, he made that point. Look, people who are living up in the mountains, occupying land and building their thing. He said, give them titles to that land and let them use it to go to the bank and get loans.
You will not be surprised to know that I was the director of the Commission on Legal Empowerment of the Poor, which was co-chaired by Madeleine Albright and Hernando de Soto.
Wonderful, wonderful. Because when you spoke just now, it reminded very much.
So you can see the influence.
Yeah. We talked about that. Paul, I had one question for the doctor, something I've been thinking about. Doc, in your experience, if you had to point to one factor that contributed mostly to the eradication of poverty, what would you say that? What would you attribute that to? Poverty on a global scale has been going down. What do you think has been the single most contributing factor, if you can frame it in such a way?
Yeah, it's a very hard question because it's the factors are different in different contexts in different countries. If we look at the global reduction of poverty, you know what drove this most significant reduction under the MDGs is reduction of poverty in one country. 470 million people.
China.
Was China.
Yeah.
So China reduced poverty better than any other country. Now, the conditions and the context of China is very different from the countries in which we live.
Yep.
Now, outside of China, if we look at India, India failed to deliver on poverty eradication, largely because India's growth was not pro-poor. So India had a lot of growth, but the growth was occurring due to the middle class entrepreneurial sector, and it was not trickling down.
Yeah.
So we did not have the macroeconomic policies in place that would have stimulated micro enterprises supporting, or engaging with the middle class, medium-sized industries. land reform or ownership of assets,
Yeah.
I think, is a critical factor. The biggest problem in South Africa for the government, for public policy, has been land redistribution.
Yeah.
The ANC campaigned and said we will redistribute the land, and it
Zimbabwe had a mess on that. And right now in India, they're still on strike on that. The farmers.
So it's a huge issue. And so to answer your question, Floyd, two big things. I believe asset ownership by people, asset ownership, and market access. So I agree with you on macroeconomic and stability, plus asset redistribution or asset ownership, but it has to be fair. I'm not talking about a Mugabe chasing out white people who own the land and giving it to black people. That's crazy. But it's not easy. I sat down with the former President Cardoso of Brazil.
Yeah.
And I asked him, what was your most difficult problem as a president? He wrote a book called The Accidental President.
Yeah.
Apparently, he didn't really want to be president because he's an academic as well. And he said land distribution.
Yeah.
Brazil is perhaps the
Latin
second
America. That is a historical
country.
persisting problem in Latin America.
Quite similar to South Africa.
Shalane, Dr. Singh, Timothy Jonas, Floyd Haynes, thank you all very much. This has been a very educating and interesting discussion. I think we should come back again, the same team, to continue down the line to continue discussing this issue. We are running out of time, and the program is going to allow a very short, because we don't have much time, a request made by attorney at law Baldeo, who's Guyanese. He comes from Little Guyana in Queens, and he has a burning issue he just wants to share very quickly before I close up the program. Mr. Baldeo, your system, your
unmute your mic.
Mr. Baldeo. Yeah, now.
Am I on?
Yeah, now you're on.
Good evening. I'm sorry to.
You heard what I said. You only.
Yes, I heard you. Yes. Good. I'm very sorry to disturb your program. I was enjoying it myself and learning a lot.
Go ahead.
People.
You lobby
Thanks
very.
for here, Little Guyana, Paul and Mr. Jonas. How are you, sir? And Ms. Baila and Miss Haynes, and I also know Mr. Singh very well. Satay Singh, Monet Singh, Yogesh Singh, all of them. So we have a friendly audience there. But let's get to this map here. Are you seeing my map?
Yeah, we're looking at the South Zone.
And we're trying to get the message out to Guyanese over here and also wherever we are in the diaspora that we wanted to unite Richmond Hill, Ozone Park, and South Ozone Park, which is this mass of land here, a very critical mass. Now, recently, they mentioned Little Guyana, and I heard you say that, and that has been international news. But the translation of that into politics is that we do not have an official seat as a base of representation, so to speak. And we're the only, although we're the second largest immigrant group in New York City, and we're the fifth largest in New York, we still don't have a seat that we can call our own. And as you know, America was built on no taxation without representation. And that principle is inured to our people from Haiti have come here and they've gotten their own seats all across New York City. I came the closest. I almost won a state Senate seat. That is like half of Guyana, 350,000. That was like 10 years ago. However, they have since chipped away at that. So what they've done is to create 4 different assembly districts here with this natural borders here as we have. Here you have a natural border of Jamaica and Hillside Avenue, or Park Lane, so to speak. Then you have the Van Wyck Expressway. Then you have the Belt Parkway. And then you have Woodhaven. Now, this is a natural configuration, a natural contiguous zone. And this is supposed to be Little Guyana, or a seat that we can call our own. However, you have a WEPRIN, Assembly District 24, that cut out this piece and takes it all the way to the Nassau Expressway, passing through many white districts. So that has diluted our vote, and we've left with this 20% here. Then there's another district here that was represented by Mike Miller. And Mike Miller also goes all the way to Glendale. There's no characteristics or nothing in common with them. Then they gave us this, then they took away this little piece. As you can see, this is the economic hub next to Kennedy Airport, which can create a lot of jobs and help, get us, our people some jobs, especially this COVID time. And you have Aqueduct here in Resorts World. Now, a lot of our money and people have been spent here building this behemoth, and this has contributed a lot to the tax revenue of New York State. However, they have taken this away and given it to Howard Beach. Now, from the time you hear Howard Beach and you hear Little Guyana, you know that the two will not mix. There have been many hate crimes, so to speak, there, and that has been the problem that we have. And then this is South Ozone Park, which Richard David ran for, and I ran for 8024. So neither of us could have won our separate seats, but we were able to at least lay the foundation to show them that when you add the votes together.
So, attorney, what is it you want? Why you said you wanted?
Oh, the most important thing is that tomorrow there's a rally and a press conference. Every 10 years, every 10 years you have this happening. This is the most important political and socio-economic event that happens in America, throughout America.
So what can be done?
Every 10 years you have the census.
What do you want people to do? You have
Not
only
you
2
personally.
minutes.
I'm asking your audience to make sure that they come out and register. They come to the rally tomorrow at 10 o'clock, which we have a rally at the Lefferts Library at Queens. That is Lefferts on Liberty. That is just on the Little Guyana sign. They can use that as a backdrop or as an Exhibit A, as we say in the courthouse. Mr. Jonas to be familiar with that. Exhibit A means the city of New York has passed a law designating Little Guyana as a compact, contiguous natural district. Then how is it we can have our own political representation where we will have a seat at the table of government? After all, this is what American participatory democracy is all about. So they must come out and be part of that rally. We're not asking them to speak. I will do the speaking. Those others who are inclined to speak can do so. But at least they can stand with this placard and let the press see. It speaks volumes that you're uniting Richmond Hill, Ozone Park, South Ozone Park. It speaks for itself. And therefore, they can come there and get the message that we want fair redistricting.
Wonderful.
Because this is the 4th decade in America I'm in, and it's the 4th go round after every 10 years that we're trying to get a fair district. And we have none. So what you have to do also, Paul, more importantly... Redistricting
is a very important issue in America, and it's...
Exactly, and it's what we call gerrymandering. They go hand in hand, where you deprive people, you box them out, and you dilute them, and you suppress them. You marginalize
but the important thing for you
this happens all over the world. It's not for Albert Baldi, it's not for Paul Tennessee, it's not for Mr. Jones, it's for everyone.
To the audience is that you have a meeting tomorrow and you want them there. Is that correct?
The meeting that's only half of it. The most important part.
You don't have much time to give too much details.
Okay, let them go on to irc.gov. They have to go on to irc.gov and register to speak.
Wonderful.
They will give 3 minutes of testimony and send them all this map. This map is available on my website with talking points on Facebook. I will
check it out myself too.
And you can give a testimony from where you are, with your knowledge and encyclopedic and historical knowledge. I know you are. I have no one to preach to the converted, but you have fought like this before. You have fought these issues before. So you go to irc.gov, Paul, Dr. Professor Paul, and register. And tell them about your experiences, that these people have been marginalized and that they deserve representation. And they will start at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So at 2 p.m., you go on the website. It's a government website. They have an independent redistricting panel. And that panel will make sure that the testimonies are heard and consolidated. So what you'll have is that we'll have a district that's called a community of interest. That's what the law states. All communities of interest must be recognized. If you recognize us as Little Guyana, if you recognize us as the 5th largest of New York State, if you recognize us as the 2nd largest immigrant population, then you must give us the bacon. You must give us our district.
Wonderful. I'd like to thank you, Mr. Baldi. I'd like to thank you that you're keeping the fight alive there in New York, Guyanese, alive and kicking, fighting for your rights. It's like here in DC, we are fighting for a state. We don't have a state, you know, so we are fighting in DC for a state too. So thank you once more. I have to close up the program. We only have a few minutes.
Correct. So I'll ask all of them to come up tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the Lefferts Library. Wonderful. And also register at irc.gov. IRC, Independent Redistricting Commission.gov.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Stand up and be counted.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Guyanese at home, Guyanese abroad. Same struggle, fighting for our rights. Now, thanks again on this program that we did on global poverty and inter-ethnic challenges. I think the views expressed here were complex, some of it complicated, but It shows that there is no one size fit all when you're dealing with these kind of issues. It's a global issue, national issue, and thanks very much for all the inputs that were made. Now, myself, Floyd Haynes, and Timothy Jonas are usually on this program the third Wednesday of every month. So I would like to advertise what is going to be the next program next month. It has to do with this book. And I am going to try and give a gift to both Timothy and Floyd on this book. It's called The Untold Story of the Berbice Slave Rebellion, Blood on the River, A Chronicle of Mutiny and Freedom on the Wild Coast by Marjolaine Cars. This is an issue, the Berbice Rebellion, that has been on my mind for many years. I've written a piece about it and about Daly's book. And I always was hoping and dreaming that somebody who knew Dutch will go into the archives. And this professor, who is of Dutch origin, went into the archives and got 900 documents of interrogations done on people, Guyanese, who were slaves who were involved in the rebellion. And she has written a very fascinating book about Berbice Rebellion. I just want to leave you with a tease. Had this Berbice Rebellion succeeded, we would have been the first independent republic in the Western Hemisphere, before Haiti and before the United States of America. It's a fascinating story, and we will get the author to come into our program, and Floyd and myself and Timothy and the Chancellor of the University of Guyana are going to read the books, and we're going to have a discussion with this lady. But I would like Guyanese to try and get this book. This is a vital, vital part of our history, of who we are and where we are today and where we are going. Very, very important. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Charlene, I know it's late, early in the morning in Johannesburg. Thank you for staying up. You look as fresh as the morning. And thanks to everybody else for being on the program. We'll keep in touch. Take care.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you all.